Resident Evil is a survival horror game published and developed by Capcom and released for the original PlayStation in the year 1996. Ports of the game for Sega Saturn and PC were also released a year later. Resident Evil is widely credited as the game that gave birth to the survival horror genre, despite the fact that games like Alone in the Dark had existed for several years before Resident Evil's initial release. However, while Resident Evil might not have been the first survival horror game, it was absolutely the first horror game to gain mainstream appeal and recognition. Resident Evil was a massive success for Capcom, selling over 2 million copies on the PlayStation alone. Later re-releases of the game, like Resident Evil Director's Cut, would also go on to sell a massive amount of copies. Resident Evil received widespread critical acclaim upon release, with critics praising the game's terrifying atmosphere, fun puzzles, and tense combat. I'm sure I don't have to mention all this to you guys anyways, you all fucking know what Resident Evil is. And if you don't, go away, please. We can't be friends. Obviously, Resident Evil has become one of the most recognisable names in gaming today, and for the most part, that reputation has been well earned. Despite a few missteps here and there, Resident Evil is still my favourite game franchise of all time by a country mile. I own all of the games, aside from a few of the shitty spin-offs, and I've purchased a few of my favourite games in the franchise, like the Ori remake, several times over. I own figurines, the shitty films. I even bought this Resident Evil 6 jacket, which is easily the worst thing ever created. And yes, I've worn this out in public. And yes, people have stared at me as if I had just killed someone. I even bought the novelization of the first book. I made it to like page 6 before I came across this line that says something about Jill being a policeman. I mean, surely the author meant to write policewoman. And no matter how hard I fucking tried, I could not get over that mistake. I did not read any more of the book after that because I simply did not care to hear anything else this woman had to say. I can't even put into words how much this series means to me, and I hope to one day give these games the reviews they deserve. But for now, I want to take a trip back in time to 1996 to see if the original Resident Evil still holds up nearly a quarter of a century later. Capcom started development on Resident Evil in 1993. It was originally intended to be a Super Nintendo game, but eventually the decision was made to move development to the far more powerful Sony PlayStation. The game was originally going to be a remake of an old NES game called Sweet Home, before it would become its own original IP called Biohazard in Japan. Capcom actually had trouble trademarking the name Biohazard in the West, and so held a contest where members of their staff would put forward their best ideas for what the game should be called. And somehow, Resident Evil was the best name they could come up with. Resident Evil was directed by Shinji Mikami, a man who would go on to create some of the greatest games ever made during his career. Funnily enough, despite being an incredibly talented individual, Mikami was only chosen to direct Resident Evil because he was apparently scared of everything, and in Capcom's eyes, that meant he was the perfect person to create a horror game. I don't quite understand that logic, to be honest, but it paid off massively, as Resident Evil was considered by many as the scariest game ever made when it was first released. During development, many ideas for how the game would look and play had to be discarded, either because of technical limitations or time constraints. In fact, Resident Evil was initially going to be played from a first-person perspective. However, Mikami was not satisfied with how real-time 3D environments looked on the PlayStation, and so the idea was eventually scrapped. Thankfully, around the same time, Mikami discovered a little game by the name of Alone in the Dark, and decided that the fixed perspective and pre-rendered backgrounds featured in the game would be a perfect fit for Resident Evil. Mikami decided to move away from traditional Japanese horror for Resident Evil, and went instead for a more western take on the genre, citing films like The Shining and Dawn of the Dead as inspirations. During the first few months of development, Shinji Mikami worked on the game entirely by himself. He designed the characters, environments, and wrote a lot of the game's script, which, depending on how you feel about it, might have been a massive mistake.
Stop it! Don't open that door!
What is it? What? What is this? What is it?
It's obvious that this project meant a lot to Mikami, and he was willing to do whatever it took to ensure the game was a success. Thankfully, all the hard work by him and his team paid off, because Resident Evil was, and to a degree still is, a wonderful little game. Anyways, enough of the history lesson. It's time to take a look at the actual game itself. Unfortunately, while I do still have my physical copy of the original game, I don't have a working PS1 to capture footage from. Don't worry though, because I have the next best thing. I'm just kidding. I wouldn't do that to you guys. All the footage from this video will be from the European version of the Director's Cut, the same version that's available to purchase on PS3 and Vita if you wish to do so. I would use the American version of the Director's Cut, but I don't want to. So immediately upon starting the game, you're treated to this cheesy as all hell opening cutscene. And this should give you a good idea of what to expect from the rest of the game. It's going to be cheesy, the story is going to be cheesy, the voice acting is going to be cheesy, and you shouldn't take the game too seriously, because it sure as hell isn't. After selecting the mode you want to play, you are then brought to the character select screen, and honestly, I feel like this part of the game could have been handled a little better. You see, even though it looks as if you're simply being given a choice to play as either a male or oh shit.
You've really gone on and out.
Sorry guys, I didn't mean to say that. Obviously there's no such thing as gender. Male and female don't exist, and you're a transphobic piece of shit if you think otherwise. So where was I? Oh yeah, so while it might look as if you're simply being given the choice to play as either a person or another person, this decision actually has huge ramifications on how difficult the game will be for you. Simply put, Jill Valentine is the game's easy mode. She can carry more items than Chris and has more weapons to play around with. There are even less enemies to deal with when playing as Jill, and the enemies that remain also take less bullets to kill. So while Jill is easily one of my favourite characters in the entire series, I almost never play as her in this game. In fact, the only reason I enjoy playing her campaign at all is because of the incomparable Barry Burton, who simply put, is worth the price of admission alone.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
Just a moment. I found something.
What is it?
It's a weapon. It's really powerful, especially against living things. Jill, here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you.
Amazing. So for that reason alone, the majority of footage seen in this review will be from Chris Redfield's campaign. I consider Chris as the game's hard mode. He can only carry 6 items at a time, and there are less weapons and ammo to find in his campaign. If you consider yourself good at survival horror games in any way, I recommend choosing Chris if you're looking for a challenge. Anyways, enough shit talk, let's start this fucker. Resident Evil's story begins when a special operations force named STARS, or Special Tactics and Rescue Squad, are sent in to investigate a series of murders in the mountains outside of Raccoon City. However, this team, codenamed Bravo Team, soon go missing, so a second team of STARS operatives are sent in to find out what exactly happened. This second team, codenamed Alpha Team, consists of 6 members: Albert Wesker, Joseph Frost, Jill Valentine, Chris Redfield, Barry Burton, and Brad Vickers. Alpha Team arrive at the crash site, but find no members of Bravo Team in the area. Shortly afterwards, however, the team are attacked by vicious dogs. Joseph is immediately killed by... Hang on a second. That's better. Yes, unfortunately, this opening cutscene was heavily censored in all versions except for the PC port. I mean, it's understandable. This was 1996, and violence like this was very rarely seen in video games. Still, it's a shame, because the uncut version of this cutscene is pretty awesome. Anyways, Brad pussies out and flies off, leaving the remaining STARS members stranded. Guys, why are you just standing there? Are zombie dogs not chasing you right now? Ah, that's better. While this opening might seem incredibly cheesy and awkward by today's standards, it was incredibly endearing back in 1996. You could tell the team were trying their best to make something atmospheric and cinematic, even if the finished result was kind of hilarious. Anyways, the remaining STARS members run towards a nearby mansion in the hopes of finding shelter and safety, and this is where the game takes a minute to introduce the game's cast to us.
We don't know where Barry is.
Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, Rebecca Chambers, Albert Wesker, Resident Evil.
Finally, the game begins. Depending on whether you play as Jill or Chris, this opening cutscene will play out differently. For example, when playing as Chris, Wesker sends you to examine the sound of gunfire coming from a nearby room. But when playing as Jill, Barry will assist you. The next room you enter is the dining room, which is an area where you are completely safe from monsters, and there is a reason for this. This room serves as almost a tutorial area, where you are given the space and freedom to get used to the game's rather archaic control scheme. You see, the classic Resident Evil games used tank controls. This control scheme is almost never used in games today, but due to the technical limitations of the time, it was almost a necessary evil that some games make use of it. Simply put, games that use tank controls feature playable characters that move, well, like a tank. So regardless of which direction your character is facing at a particular time, pushing up will always move the character forward, and pushing left or right will always turn your character in that direction. It definitely takes some time to get used to, but once you do, it becomes second nature. So once you are comfortable with the controls, you're free to move into the next area, and this is where shit gets real. This cutscene fucking terrified me as a child, and even today, there is still something so unsettling about how the zombie turns around and stares at you. So this is the first encounter with an enemy in Resident Evil, and most first time players are probably going to make some serious mistakes here. For example, if you're playing as Chris, you don't have access to a handgun yet, but you do have a knife. However, if you try to use the knife to kill the zombie, you are probably going to die. On the other hand, if you're playing as Jill, she does have a handgun, but using your limited bullets to kill the zombie would be a mistake, as you can simply run back to the dining room and have Barry blow its head off.
What is it?
Watch out! It's a monster!
Let me take care of this.
So even from the game's first moments, the difference in difficulty from Chris to Jill's campaign is plain to see. Anyway, After this scene, we return to the main hall, only to find that Wesker is nowhere to be found. If you are playing as Chris, this is where you finally get your hands on a gun. However, if you are playing as the
master of unlocking,
you gain access to the lockpick, which opens up a huge area of the map immediately, allowing Jill to gain access to the shotgun long before Chris does. During the first few hours of the game, a lot of players are probably going to be shocked at just how difficult the original Resident Evil can be, especially if you don't know where you are going. There simply isn't enough ammo to take out all enemies in the mansion, so knowing which zombies to fight and which to avoid becomes a life or death decision. Combat is awkward and clunky by design. You can't move while aiming your weapon, so keeping a good distance between you and your enemy is a necessity. Your starting pistol is enough to deal with the zombie and dog type enemies, but using it against something like a hunter is a death wish. The shotgun is my favourite all-round weapon in the game, as it can destroy zombies with a single blast, and can kill practically any other enemy in a few shots if used from close enough range. Combat should only be used as a last resort, however, as most enemies are able to finish you off with just 1 or 2 attacks. Trying to avoid encounters whenever possible is always the best option if you want to survive. And I think it's for that reason alone that I still love the original Resident Evil, even if it has aged slightly compared to some of its older siblings. The game simply doesn't give a fuck whether you live or die. Enemies are vicious, with some being able to kill you in a single attack. There are no checkpoints when you die, and even saving the bloody game requires you to use an ink ribbon, which are very scarce in the mansion. Resident Evil is cruel and brutal, and that's why I love it. It's the original Dark Souls as far as I'm concerned. It's a game that will beat you into the ground repeatedly, and when you beg for mercy, it will simply whisper in your ear, "Get good." So if any of you guys are tempted to give this game a try, here are some quick tips for the first hour of the game to make your life a little easier. Check Kenneth's body 3 times for 2 ammo clips at the beginning of the game. If you are having trouble finding Kenneth, just look for the guy who has become a shadow of his former self. Jesus fucking Christ. When a zombie falls to the ground, it doesn't necessarily mean it's dead. If you are not sure, either shoot the zombie while it's lying on the ground, or look for a puddle of blood to confirm it's dead. Play as Jill if you are new to the series. She's better than Chris in every way, and your playthrough will be a far more comfortable ride using her. So now that's all out of the way, I guess the next question is, what do you actually do in Resident Evil? Well, I'm glad you asked. Resident Evil's gameplay has elements of several different genres. It has elements of Metroid, with its semi-open map. It has elements of a point-and-click adventure game, with its exploration and puzzle solving. And it has elements of a survival game, with its focus on resource management and brutal difficulty. When you meld all these genres together, you get the Frankenstein's monster that makes up a classic survival horror game. Honestly, a game like Resident Evil simply shouldn't work, but somehow it does. Level design is simply outstanding. The Spencer Mansion feels like a real actual place. A fucked up real actual place, full of traps and puzzles, but a real place nonetheless. The map design is so iconic at this point that most returning players could easily complete the entire game without ever once referencing the in-game map. No room feels wasted. Everything serves a purpose. It's old school game design at its best. Speaking of the puzzles, they're rather simplistic compared to later entries in the series, but they still serve as a nice break from the constant action and tension found elsewhere in the game. Actually, come to think of it, the puzzles can be pretty tense too. Why is that music playing? I did the puzzle right? Why are the crows looking at me like that? Oh fuck this, I'm out of here. I think most people today are sick to death of zombie games. However, Resident Evil was the first game to do zombies right, and very few games to this day have nailed the living dead quite like Resident Evil 1 has. Firstly, when most people think of a quote-unquote zombie game today, they usually think of a massive open world game or a multiplayer shooter. Traditional zombies do not work in this context. Zombies are slow and clumsy, but because those kind of zombies wouldn't suit something like Call of Duty, developers started to change the zombie so that it could run and leap, and in some cases even use weapons. If you asked young people today what a zombie is, they'd probably describe to you a normal human being, just one with a severe mental disability. Resident Evil does not do that. It makes the most of its zombies by placing them in enclosed hallways and locations where you don't have much room to maneuver. Yes, the zombies in Resident Evil are slow and stupid, but they really make the most of the game's environment, and that's all that matters. Thankfully, however, zombies are not the only enemy type you'll be facing throughout the game, and that's another strength the Resident Evil series has over other horror franchises that use zombies as its sole enemy type. Probably my favourite enemy type in the game is the Hunter, terrifying lizard-like creatures that can decapitate you with a single swipe if you aren't careful. I'm always on the edge of my seat when facing these things. There are other enemies too, like a shark that only appears in one room for some reason. I don't know, I always felt this moment was a wasted opportunity. It's handled much better in the remake. One thing I absolutely love about some of the enemies, however, is how their AI works, and the tactics you can employ to potentially avoid having to fight them. For example, the zombie dogs you come across out in the courtyard will not engage you as long as you don't approach them and don't run. By using your head, you can potentially save a lot of ammo and a lot of health by avoiding certain confrontations. Unfortunately, boss fights don't fare nearly as well. In fact, in most cases, they straight up don't work. Take this fight with a snake for example. It's nigh on impossible to defeat this snake without taking damage, especially when playing the vanilla version of Resident Evil. That version does not contain auto-aim, and instead requires you to manually aim at your targets, which makes boss fights much tougher. Boss fights would improve as the series progressed, but they are a bit of a mixed bag here. Sound is one of the most important aspects of any survival horror game, and back in 1996, Resident Evil was in a league of its own when it came to good sound design. Which is a strange thing to say because a lot of your playtime will be spent listening to this. Silence. But it's how silence is used that's so impressive. Take this room for example. It's quiet and there are no enemies about. By this point, you've been taught that zombies make their presence known by making a moaning noise, but there isn't a sound to be heard. So when most new players reach this room for the first time, they will more than likely assume they are safe, and will hurry through the room, only for this to happen. The first time I saw that dog jump through the window back in 1996, I nearly shat myself. Sure, it isn't that scary by today's standards, but most people back in 1996 weren't used to enemies being able to break through windows to get to you. All of a sudden, nowhere in the mansion felt safe, and you constantly had to keep your wits about you. I can't talk about the original Resident Evil without mentioning its amazing soundtrack. For fuck's sake, not that one! Resident Evil's soundtrack, as featured in most releases of the game, is one of the most iconic video game scores ever created. The music builds dread perfectly. Even if you know a room is safe, some tracks will have you wanting to get the fuck out of there as soon as possible. Outstanding stuff. One of the best things about the original Resident Evil was the sheer amount of environmental variety in the game. While the first few hours of Resident Evil give off the impression that the entire game is going to take place in this one mansion, by exploring and solving puzzles, you'll eventually find your way out of the mansion through a rear exit. This exit leads to a courtyard swarming with zombie dogs, the things we were hiding from in the first place. Moving through the courtyard eventually leads to a garden house. Once you complete this area by defeating a big ass plant, you then have to return to the mansion to open up any remaining locked doors, but this time hunters roam the mansion instead of zombies. Completing this location again leads you to a short cave area, including zombie boulders that can crush you. Okay, so they're not really zombie boulders, but come on, zombie boulders would be pretty awesome. Finally, getting through the cave area will lead you to the secret Umbrella research facility. I love how the original Resident Evil messes with your expectations. I mean, okay, it's common knowledge at this point that there is going to be a hidden research facility in a Resident Evil game, regardless of where the game is set. But no one expected that kind of twist back in 1996. The original Resident Evil took pleasure in shattering your expectations, and I love it for that. So I guess that leaves the narrative to talk about, and honestly, it's a pretty enjoyable story, even with the poor script and dodgy acting. Thankfully, a lot of the story is told to you through diaries and text documents you find in the world, instead of traditional cutscenes, and some of these documents actually got an emotional response from me. Reading about the people who used to work in the mansion, and the hell many of them got subjected to, is kinda sad. The story itself has the usual twists and turns that most people will see coming a mile away. Wow, this guy is acting really strange, and there's ominous music playing. I wonder if I can really trust him. But the game's plot gets the job done, and there are even multiple endings to encourage repeat playthroughs. Oh yeah, and Rebecca. I forgot to mention Rebecca.
What? Oh no! Sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
She's a cunt. Overall, the original Resident Evil still holds up to this day. It has goofy acting and dated visuals, but exploring the Spencer Mansion is a fun time, and the game can still be effective at creating a tense atmosphere. It's challenging, has superb level design, and won't take a lifetime to complete. I would encourage most people who are interested in trying out the game to give it a go. However, if you are eager to play the original Resident Evil, there is now a far better way to do so. Resident Evil Remake was released in 2002 for the Nintendo GameCube, and as the name suggests, it was a full-on remake of the original PS1 game. However, calling this game a simple remake would be selling it short. In many ways, Resident Evil Remake feels like an entirely different game from the 1996 original. There are new areas, new puzzles, new monsters, new game modes, and new cutscenes. The visuals have seen a massive jump in quality, to the point of nearly looking photorealistic at times. Character models are also far more detailed and animate more realistically. Enemies can now follow you into other rooms, and are even more deadlier than ever. Simply put, Resident Evil Remake is unquestionably the best way to experience the original game. It improves on every single aspect of the PS1 game, while also adding a shit ton of new content. It is also my second favourite Resident Evil game of all time, the first being the Resident Evil 2 remake. Thankfully, Resident Evil Remake is not too hard to find these days, as the game has since been released on PS4, PS3, Xbox One, Xbox 360, Nintendo Switch, and PC, so there's no excuse to not give it a go. I will absolutely be giving the remake the proper review treatment in future, but for now, I hope you all enjoyed this look back at the original Resident Evil. Personally, I was shocked by how well this game holds up, nearly 25 years later. It's not my favourite in the series by any means, but it's still easily one of the most important games ever made. Without Resident Evil 1, horror franchises like Silent Hill, Fatal Frame, Amnesia, Dead Space, and several others might never have existed, and for that reason alone I am eternally grateful for this game.